Good morning, and thank you for attending the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom's hearing today on China's religious freedom violations, domestic repression, and malign influence abroad. I would also like to thank our distinguished witnesses for joining us and offering their expertise today. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or commonly known as USCIRF, is an independent, bipartisan U.S. government advisory body created by the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act, or IRFA. The Commission uses international standards to monitor freedom of religion or belief abroad and makes policy recommendations to the United States government. Today, USCIRF exercises its statutory authority under IRFA to convene this important hearing. China is unambiguously one of the most repressive countries and the worst religious freedom violators and human rights abusers in the world. The most recent example is its repressive tactics on display for the world to see in responding to protesters throughout China and the world regarding its zero COVID policy. The protesters are in part sparked by the tragic death caused by a fire in Urumqi amid strict zero COVID lockdown since fall of this year. Chinese officials are stopping individuals randomly on the street and searching and deleting any social media content and communications related to the protest from their phones. Officials also have threatened overseas Chinese citizens, coercing them to delete such content. USCIRF has repeatedly recommended China's designation as a country of particular concern, or CPC, a designation that the State Department has consistently applied since 1999, soon after the passage of IRFA. The State Department announced its most recent CPC designation, including China, on December 2nd. In the past decade, religious freedom conditions in the country have rapidly deteriorated under the brutal rule of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, under the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. The CCP's techno-authoritarianism, transnational repression, and other forms of malign influence abroad represent some of the most troubling aspects of its religious tyranny, impacting Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, Catholics, Protestant Christians, and many other religious groups. Uyghur Muslims, for example, have long fallen victim of China's techno-authoritarianism and transnational repression. The Chinese government has used advanced surveillance technology as an integral part of its repression in the Uyghur homeland. Chinese tech companies, both state-owned enterprises and private companies such as Huawei and others, play a vital role in facilitating and implementing the CCP's oppressive policies in the Uyghur region. Moreover, the Uyghurs continue to experience terror and intimidation even after they have escaped to other countries. Many of them fear for their safety and the safety of their family members who remain in Xinjiang, as well as the threat of forcible deportation by some countries that are under Chinese government's pressure. The United States must continue to vigorously enforce policies to ensure that our nation's trade policies do not contribute to CCP's religious persecution. We must also actively counter its malign foreign influences and transnational repression, including here in the United States. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Vice Chair Abraham Cooper, for his remarks and introduce our witnesses.
Few countries in the world can match China's technologically sophisticated religious repression and its unique ability to assert malign influences over and to extend repression into other countries. I personally experienced this at a rally, a human rights rally held in Los Angeles 2 weeks ago, when dozens of Chinese students felt the need to wear masks or to cover their faces with a white piece of paper in order to deflect and avoid detection, facial recognition detection from China. The long-range implications on that will affect every citizen in the United States and beyond. More specifically, though, in this regard, China presents a unique challenge to the U.S. foreign policy and our national security interests. That harsh reality makes today's hearing especially timely and important, as it will address both China's technology-enabled domestic religious repression and its malign influence on the streets of the United States of America and its malign influences in almost every country in the world. As Chair Turkel mentioned, the US government must do its part to ensure that our business community, trade policies do not contribute to religious freedom violations in China, which remain systematic, ongoing, and egregious. We must make sure that United States companies do not export critical technologies that China could use in its techno-authoritarian repression of religious minorities. We must also make sure that products tainted by Uyghur forced labor are not imported into the US market. Furthermore, the United States government should use all legal and policy tools at its disposal to counter the Chinese government's malign foreign influence through its lobbying efforts and transnational repression activities in the US, which harass and intimidate religious minorities from China, a fact that I personally experienced just a few days ago and witnessed. The US government must also continue to work with like-minded international partners to hold the Chinese government accountable, including imposing coordinated sanctions on Chinese officials and entities responsible for severe religious violations and related human rights abuses. With that, I look forward to a robust and fruitful discussion today with our distinguished witnesses, and it is my honor to turn over to Commissioner Frank Wolf, the inspiration for all the other commissioners here at USCIRF, for his timely remarks. Commissioner Wolf.
Thank you, Vice Chair Cooper. I appreciate it. China is indeed one of the worst religious freedom violators in the world today. Its religious repression has severely impacted many religious groups inside China, as well as those that are overseas. This precious freedom is also under attack in Hong Kong, a city that was once free and prosperous, an international financial center with a high degree of autonomy, and civil liberties were guaranteed under the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Today, the Chinese government has broken its promises and is eviscerating the rule of law and civil liberties in Hong Kong. Religious freedom is a fundamental right that will inevitably suffer as well. In fact, the Chinese government's latest victim is the 90-year-old Cardinal Joseph Zen. Cardinal Zen is a tireless religious freedom advocate for underground Catholics in China and is almost the face of the Catholic Church. And to see what they're doing to a 90-year-old man is unbelievable. I'm gravely concerned that the Chinese and Hong Kong authorities will use the infamous national security law to target Cardinal Zen and other religious leaders and communities that are participating in democracy protests in Hong Kong. We must speak out against this injustice. I'm also greatly concerned about China's malign foreign influence here in the United States, most insidiously through its lobbying efforts on Capitol Hill. I am very disappointed that some former members of Congress, both political parties, have decided to work as agents to lobby for the Chinese government and its state-owned enterprises such as Hikvision, and is under suspicion, for complicity in the government's persecution of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. Their involvement in such effort is just outrageous, and I thought I would never, ever see something like this. There should be a law prohibiting lobbying for China. Another important subject regards the 64 members of the Mayflower Church who are seeking asylum here in the United States. I appreciate the State Department and Ambassador Rashid Hussein's close attention. He's been very good on this, on the freedom of the Mayflower Church people. Given the continuing realistic danger of them being forcibly repatriated to China from Thailand, the Chinese come in and arrest 2 or 3, take them away. They're never seen again. I urge the State Department to send U.S. Embassy diplomats to make regular visits to the 64 members of the Mayflower Church. The relevant parties will then know that we in the United States and the United States government and the Biden administration do care about the religious freedom and safety of this group. I pray they can safely come to the United States very soon. In closing, we must address the rapidly deteriorating religious freedom situations in China, and we must counter the Chinese Communist Party government's increasing malign influence and transnational repression overseas. And with that, I'll turn it back to Chairman Turkle.
Commissioner Wolf, thank you so much. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Commissioner Wolf for his exemplary leadership, protecting, advancing human rights and religious freedom, not only in China, but around the world. I have had the fortune to meet then Congressman Wolf while I was a law student. The Uyghur community in particular know 4 names very well: late Congressman Tom Nentos, Congressman Wolf, then Representative Nancy Pelosi, Chris Smith. You look at those 4 giant leaders advancing human rights, you can see the human rights and religious freedom issues have been a bipartisan concern for the United States Congress. With that, I'm going to introduce another leader, Senator Marco Rubio, Vice Chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and Senior Member of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, who has provided pre-recorded remarks for this hearing. Not only this, but he has been supporting our work and literally attending, supporting, providing similar type of remarks in the past hearings and briefings that we have organized. Thank you very much. If you could go ahead to play the pre-recorded remarks.
Hello, I'm Senator Marco Rubio, and I want to thank the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom for having today's hearing. The Chinese Communist Party has been attacking religious freedom since its founding a century ago. Oppression is frankly in its DNA. Today, Beijing's assault is more violent and systematic than ever. In Xinjiang, it has even amounted to genocide. Party agents are also targeting ethnic Chinese believers here in the United States because they believe faith undermines the legitimacy of the Communist Party. This is a threat to American national security and basic human rights. We must do everything we can to counter this. So I hope today's hearing sheds further light on Beijing's abuses and inspires meaningful action against them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Rubio. With that, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. More detailed biographies of our witnesses will be shown in the chat box, and their bios also can be found on our website, USCIRF.gov. We have a group of outstanding witnesses whom I have had the opportunity to learn from and follow over the years, starting with our first witness, Wang Yaqiu, who is a senior researcher at the Human Rights Watch. Her team has been extraordinarily powerful, persistent in the efforts to shine a spotlight early on the Uyghur atrocities. This goes way back in 2016 when the Egyptian government forcibly removed the Uyghur students. And then we will hear from my good friend Buching Sering, the interim president of ICT, who have been a colleague and friend over the years and taught me so much about the Tibetan struggle. And then we will hear from Luisa Griva, former vice president of the National Endowment for Democracy, who is currently serving as the director of global advocacy at the Human Rights Project. Then we will have Reverend Bob Fu, who has been an incredible leader advocating religious freedom for the Christian community and others in China, who is the founder of China Aid Association. And lastly, we will hear from Jack Smith, legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, where he is part of the Massey Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. If I could, I'd like to give the floor to Wang Yaqiu.
Thank you, Chairman Turco, Vice Chairman Cooper, and honorable commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. Since I'm the first speaker, I will give a quick recap of some of the recent developments on Chinese government repression of religion. And then I will offer some key recommendations. Since 2016, when President Xi Jinping called for synthesization of religions, state control over religion in China has obviously strengthened. Authorities now seek to comprehensively reshape religions such that they consistent with the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party and to promote allegiance to the party and to President Xi. Technology-based censorship and surveillance are central to religious repression in China. Some American technology companies also contributed to the Chinese government repression on religion. With regard to Christians in China, one of the most notable developments is regarding an agreement between the Vatican and the Chinese government. The agreement was first signed in 2018 on the appointment of Catholic bishops. The agreement was renewed in 2020 and now again renewed in October this year. Despite the Chinese government's arrest of Cardinal Joseph Zen in Hong Kong, as Councilman Wolf mentioned, and just a month after the renewal, in November, the Vatican, in an official statement, expressed surprise and regret, I quote, surprise and regret that the Chinese authorities violated the agreement by installing a bishop that are not recognized by the Holy See. Well, I don't think the Vatican should be surprised because many, including HRW, had warned the Holy See at the time. I hope, the Pope learned a lesson from it and changed his mind after this, and he can speak up publicly about the persecutions of Catholics, Christians, and others in China. And in 2021, Apple took down a popular Quran app and a Bible app in China's App Store at the request of Chinese officials. Apple has over the years taken down hundreds of VPNs, seriously impeding the ability for users in China to access free information, including information about religious issues. In Xinjiang, as it's widely known that the Chinese authorities have detained 1 million or more Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims for political re-education, so-called political re-education, and subject those who are not confined in camps and prisons to omnipresent surveillance. In 2017, Human Rights Watch uncovered the US medical company, Thermo Fisher Scientific, had sold DNA sequencers to the Xinjiang police. And after we publicized this, after media reporting on this, in 2019, Thermo Fisher finally announced that it would stop selling human identification technology in Xinjiang. Sadly, it was later found that Thermo Fisher had also sold DNA kits to police in Tibet. Human Rights Watch's recent research shows Chinese authorities are significantly increasing policing, including the arbitrary collection of DNA from residents, including children, throughout Tibet, despite the wide condemnation around the world in its DNA collection in Xinjiang. And Falun Gong practitioners in China continue to face severe repression. In January, a practitioner, Xu Na, was sentenced to 80 years, merely for sending information about COVID-19 restrictions to an overseas Falun Gong affiliated website. And the Chinese government's religious repression stretches beyond its borders, as Commissioner Cooper mentioned earlier. An effective way of doing that is to leverage the Chinese economic power. The Chinese government has compelled other governments around the world to repatriate many Uyghurs, Christians, and Tibetans who have fled China. A powerful tool by the Chinese government to censor and survey overseas people is the app WeChat. It's a super app that has many functions as messaging, social media, financial services, that nearly everybody who has a smartphone in China has to use this. Because the Chinese government has banned so many international social media apps, messaging apps. So anyone outside of China who wants to connect with anybody in China has to use the WeChat app and then get sucked into the Chinese government's machinery of censorship and surveillance. I know other panelists will speak more in detail of some of the issues I mentioned above. So I will end with some Human Rights Watch recommendations. One thing that the US can do and is very much in control is to ensure that religious communities in this country with ties to China are free from threats, harassment, or persecution by the Chinese government. And the US government needs to further impose visa bans, travel bans, and targeted sanctions on Chinese officials responsible for religious repression under the Global Magnitsky Act. The US government needs to encourage other governments to adopt similar legislations in the EU, in Canada, in the UK, and other countries. Sanctions will be more effective when pursued collectively. The US government should also encourage prosecutions on the basis of universal jurisdiction laws against Chinese officials implicated in religious persecution. I know the Uyghur Human Rights Project has filed such a case in Argentina. I know the US government is looking into Chinese apps, TikTok and WeChat's censorship and surveillance issues. Yesterday, Senator Marco Rubio has introduced a bill to ban TikTok. At least we need more scrutiny towards these companies, forcing them to at least be transparent about what they're doing with Americans' data, what kind of things they're censoring, what kind of communication they're having with the Chinese government, whether the Chinese government, has demanded them to do anything regarding, their operations in the US. And we need those companies to conduct human rights due diligence, at least for the portion of their US operations. And those are, very much the US government has in control in terms of, what the Chinese government can do and cannot do in the US. And the US government also needs to escalate actions against companies that are complicit in Chinese government's repression on religion, whether those are American companies or Chinese companies. Lastly, speaking as someone from China who grew up under censorship, the US government needs to invest in technologies that help people in China to circumvent censorship. People wanted to practice their religion freely. People wanted to fight for their religious freedom in China. But first, the people in China needs free information. And I think the US government needs to lend a hand to help people to circumvent the censorship and get the information they want. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can go to Buching Sering.
Thank you, thank you, Chairman Nuri Turkel.
Thank you.
I want to thank USCIRF for providing us with this opportunity. I would like to touch the issue of today's hearing, through a policy perspective, and would like to submit the full text of my testimony for the record, and will give a gist here, with your permission, Chairman.
Yes,
In recent years,
thank you.
particularly following the assumption of office by President Xi Jinping, the Chinese government's policy on Tibetan religion has moved from total destruction of Tibetan religious institutions and systems to one of insidious control in an attempt to serve its own political objectives, which includes cynicizing Tibetan Buddhism and co-opting the right to determine Tibetan Buddhists' own leaders and mode of practice. Over the years, they have attempted to do this through promulgation of various regulations to bring Tibetan monasteries and monastics under tighter control and eventually under their total supervision. One aspect of the issue is on the reincarnation of Tibetan Buddhist leaders. Since China has not been able to place the present Dalai Lama under its control, its transparent plan is to ensure the next Dalai Lama will be subservient to the Chinese Communist Party. Not only do the Chinese government's claims completely disregard centuries-old Tibetan religious tradition, they also violate the universal principle of religious freedom. The Dalai Lama has categorically maintained that only he can make a decision regarding his reincarnation. In 2011, he released a formal statement explaining his position on the reincarnation system and how he intends to handle the issue of his succession. With your permission, I would like to submit the full text of the Dalai Lama's statement for the record. By attempting to select the next Dalai Lama, the Chinese government also aims to extend its control over Tibetan Buddhism with clear geopolitical implications, even on many Tibetan Buddhist institutions in the Indian subcontinent, Mongolia, and other parts of the world where there are followers of Tibetan Buddhism. If not challenged vigorously by free countries, this decision would affect the religious freedom not only of Tibetans, but also of millions of followers of Tibetan Buddhism, including here in the United States. On the issue of techno-authoritarianism, and before I do that, I also want to say that the issue of these reincarnation processes clearly linked to Chinese usage of the technology in Tibet to make the Tibetan people completely forget the Dalai Lama and to be subservient to the religious leaders the Chinese authorities themselves are appointing. The US and international bodies must recognize and investigate the continuity between past forms of oppression and present-day forms of persecution as fueling the same agenda to dismantle Tibetan unity through use of techno-authoritarianism. New, dangerously potent techno-surveillance and oppression are now being perpetrated behind a digital iron curtain in an attempt to hide the reality on the ground and further extend the CCP's long arm of authoritarianism. We also must take seriously the pervasiveness of the surveillance in and outside of Tibet and the harm it's doing psychologically. During our annual advocacy day for Tibet here in Washington, D.C., we learned that one of our participants, a young student, had received a series of derogatory comments within hours of posting a video of herself in Tibetan clothes on TikTok, which was mentioned earlier. The posts range from standardized CCP propaganda to slurs and more. In a heartbreaking moment, she relayed that she had started to even doubt who she was, what she was. That's not surveillance. That's digital harassment of a young American. And it reflects the length to which the CCP will go in its agenda to uproot identity as a whole. In the wake of the recent protests in Chinese cities against COVID restrictions, we saw reports of Chinese officials threatening the public through search of their mobile phones. For Tibetans, this search of their personal phones, belongings, and monasteries is the norm and has been the norm. Even today, the very possession of a portrait of the Dalai Lama, even on a mobile phone, is regarded as a crime and subjected to punishment. We have also heard of reports of Chinese authorities banning Tibetans from circulating Buddhist texts over the social media or through messaging platforms. In this connection, we commend the Biden administration for including Wu Yingzhe and Tang Hongbo, two senior Chinese officials in its recent list of Treasury Department sanctions for the abuses of Tibetan human rights. The Chinese government should be held accountable for violating international laws and China's own laws when it comes to the rights of the Tibetan people. I would like to end with some recommendations from ICT. One, USCIRF should urge Biden administration to implement fully the Tibetan Policy Support Act of 2020, which says that the Chinese government should be held accountable for interfering in Tibetan reincarnation process system, including that of the Dalai Lama. Secondly, it should urge the Biden administration to work multilaterally with like-minded countries and international bodies, including the EU, to take coordinated initiatives. Third, we urge USCIRF to endorse HR 8365, promoting a resolution of the Tibet-China Conflict Act, which challenges abuse of Tibetan rights. Fourthly, USCIRF should call on the US Senate to introduce a similar legislation to HR 8365. Fifthly, USCIRF should urge Congress to pursue appropriate legislation to put in place meaningful barriers for the spread of techno-authoritarianism by China to other nations, including the United States. Six, China should be urged to release all prisoners, political prisoners, and particularly the 11th Panchen Lama, who has not been seen since 1995. Seventh, we urge USCIRF to organize a delegation to Tibet to understand the situation there, and also to urge Congress to do likewise. We know Congressman Frank Wood visited Tibet many years back. Eighthly, USCIRF should urge the State Department to make greater use of the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act by announcing the names of Chinese officials sanctioned under the Act. Ninthly, USCIRF should urge United Nations to conduct an analysis of forced separation of children from families to boarding schools, and including the use of a DNA database that was mentioned earlier. And lastly, USCIRF should urge the United States Congress, the European Union, the UN, and other international bodies to mount forceful opposition to the CCP's imposition of modern-day slavery in Tibet, including forced displacement of nomadic peoples and enclaves diverse from their centuries-old culture, which provides little or no meaningful employment opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm hearing a static noise in the back. Is that only me or anyone else? Okay. Buchung, you may want to check your audio. We have towards the end of your testimony, when you start sharing some policy recommendations, I heard some noise in the background. You may have a connection issue. Luisa Griva, if I could go to you next, you may begin your testimony.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the USCIRF staff and commissioners for your very strong leadership on this issue, not only in your advisory capacity on US policy, but also in setting the agenda globally. I'd like to start with a positive message regarding the US response to the Uyghur genocide. The US has to date imposed a total of 107 punitive sanctions targeting perpetrators of the repression against Uyghurs. This is unfortunately 102 more than any other government. Magnitsky sanctions, other visa bans, import bans, export bans, and investment bans. These target 33 PRC officials and agencies and 57 Chinese companies, private sector, nominally private sector. And of course, some are subject to 2 or more. And the vigor of this effort, along with congressional enactments, is still not enough. We are certainly calling for more Magnitsky sanctions and many other actions. But this is effective enough to stimulate the counter sanctions by the Chinese government that have targeted USCIRF commissioners, Chairman Turkel among them, and the intensive lobbying we are hearing more about today. So there's an unprecedented human rights crisis in the Uyghur region, but also a crisis outside China's borders. The latter includes subverting the functioning of the UN human rights system. It includes the influence operations that are an attempt to prevent our government, our Congress, from protecting democratic rights. And it includes a refugee crisis that has received almost no international attention or policy response, despite the very welcome USCIRF hearing now 2 years ago on refugees fleeing religious persecution. In regard to the refugee crisis, UHRP has been urging the Congress to pass the Uyghur Human Rights Protection Act, S 1080 and HR 1630. Today, I'd like to highlight just two aspects of the genocide before returning to transnational repression. UHRP has just published a new report on forced and incentivized interethnic, interfaith marriage. We found extensive documentation that officials in the Uyghur region have been directed to promote interethnic, quote, contact, exchange, and mingling, just like in Tibet. And I hope you've all seen the wedding photo from Aksu, which is promoted by the government, where the bride and the groom are posing with local village officials. They're holding signs showing the 10,000 yuan reward that the couple is receiving as an incentive for interethnic marriages. The budget for these payments appears in county level government documents. There's one video where a Han Chinese Uyghur couple is thanking the CCP for the, quote, beautiful life that the government has given them. And the voiceover says there is a, quote, urgent need for 100 brides to, quote, actively respond to the call from the government to promote marriage between Uyghurs and Han. There's even an informal marriage guide for male Han cadres from 2019 called How to Win the Heart of a Uyghur Girl. We've concluded there's a systematic effort going on, and these forced marriages are forms of gender-based crimes. They further the ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity being committed in East Turkestan, along with the forced abortions, forced sterilizations, forced birth control, sexual abuse, and institutional rape that have been documented by Nuri Turkel in his book, for example, No Escape, and of course by USCIRF more generally. So this is a very rare case, and possibly the only case anywhere in the world where a member state of the United Nations is engaged in promoting forced interfaith, interstate, interethnic marriage by state action. And so we are asking that USCIRF highlight this crime in your reporting. The other issue is the detention of religious figures. The UHRP has compiled an extensive database, published in a report 2 years ago. We have more than 1,000 confirmed cases of detention and imprisonment of imams and other religious leaders. We have names of 428 sent to formal prisons. We're documenting prison sentence of 15 to 20 years for, quote, teaching others to pray and, quote, refusing to hand in a Quran to be burned, along with a life sentence for, quote, spreading the faith. So given extreme secrecy, this is certainly a small fraction of the total. Now, turning to abuses abroad, and given the scale of lobbying, both by PRC actors, specifically on these tech issues, and their American friends, I would like to suggest that USCIRF work to develop or endorse a surveillance technology bill of rights for religious freedom. And such a charter would provide normative standards. This would apply to the private sector, for government procurement, and for national policies in terms of restricting exports and research partnerships between US and Chinese entities. And this should not only apply to the US, it should apply to judging the CPCs, the special watch list countries that USCIRF is focused on, and all state actors. Why is this so important? Well, we've already talked about, the tremendous suppression of tech tools used for suppression in China, of course, for Tibetans abroad, for Uyghurs and others from East Turkestan. The UHRP has published 9 reports just in the last 5 years. Just as an example, we have over 1,500 serious cases of human rights abuses suffered by Uyghurs outside China at China's behest. 292 known cases of Uyghurs deported to China from Arab states alone. And even in the democratic countries, we conducted a survey in 2021, 74% reported digital threats and harassment. And unfortunately, only 21% felt that their host governments would fix these issues. In terms of the US, we published an extensive report in 2019. We briefed national law enforcement about the reports. Our conclusion is that this intimidation campaign is not just a matter of violation of norms. This is against the law. It is illegal under federal law to issue threats that interfere with free speech rights. And so for Uyghur Americans, this menacing presence of the Chinese government in their daily lives deprives them of their constitutional rights. So the Uyghur Human Rights Project would like to ask USCIRF if you can do something that may be unprecedented, but on behalf of the Tibetans, the Christians, the others who are the dissidents who are suffering this kind of almost untrammeled international repression, we'd like USCIRF to maybe take the step of following up with our national law enforcement. The FBI issued a counterintelligence bulletin. Would it be appropriate? We hope that USCIRF will be in touch to press for an update on the strategy to deter and punish these crimes. I have additional policy recommendations in my written testimony, and I'd be happy to discuss them later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louisa. Thank you. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank your team at the UHRP. That has been incredibly effective, documenting and reporting on those issues that we have been discussing today. With that, I'd like to go to Pastor Bafu for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Turkle and Vice Chairman Cooper and the whole the honorable commissioners who are here today. And I also want to really show my gratitude for the hardworking staff at the USCIRF, and certainly also over the past few years during this hard time. Thank you for paying attention on the individual cases, the policy issues, and I also want to thank your counterpart at the State Department, Ambassador Rashad, and his team, the DRL, for helping free many of those who are stuck, even while fleeing of the persecution for the religious freedom. So in recent years, the CCP has steadily increased the oppression and control of Christians, particularly through the use of technology. The authoritarianism in China has begun to reach a new extreme under Xi Jinping in his third term as General Secretary of the Communist Party. According to the new regulations just passed this year, no organization or individual may post any religious information or service on the internet unless permission is obtained from a provincial level government departments. And content posted by individuals, groups, or organizations must conform to the CCP government political agendas and must encourage others to, I quote, love the country and abide by the law, end quote. So due to these new restrictions, the Christian WeChat accounts and other groups have become a main area of suppression, as other fellow witnesses have already said in some aspects. This is an especially cruel, of course, limitation made the long, strict lockdowns for China's zero so-called COVID policy. The Chinese authorities also sought to track their movements through the required, of course, the COVID QR code, facial recognition technology, and CCTV cameras in and around churches and homes. However, this technology is not just contained within China's border. It is being weaponized in the growing transnational repressions of Chinese Christians around the world, as Louisa even mentioned, extended into the US border. While the CCP has a broad and extensive history of this, the case of Mayflower Church is one that will continue to develop. In an unprecedented move, a church made up of 28 adults, 32 children from Shenzhen Holy Reformed Church, led by Pastor Pan Yingguang, left China and arrived on Jeju Island, South Korea in November 2019 after enduring tremendous religious persecution. The asylum seekers have been nicknamed the Mayflower Church for their commitment to seeking the freedom to practice their faith with their community. And as detailed in the CSW report, the church has faced harassment of the CCP since its founding in 2012, with refusal to install the face recognition cameras in the church, and a frequent interrogation of leaders and pressure them to join the government-sanctioned Three Self-Churches movement. And the CCP threats against these church members continued in South Korea by utilizing technology to manipulate their return to China. The PRC consulate in Jeju called members of the church repeatedly and accusing them of treason and subversion of state power, a charge often used to silence and imprison Chinese pastors and other religious believers. Authorities demanded their immediate return to face the so-called consequence of their actions of exile and to recant their accusation of religious persecution. And the families of the church who remained in China, all of them have seen a dramatic increase in harassment and secret interrogation by the Chinese state security and public security. And authorities even sought to locate Pastor Pan and others by forcing their family members in China to urge the asylum seekers to reactivate their WeChat accounts. So having exhausted the ROK asylum system, facing the loss of their legal status, and fearing a refoulement, the group voted to leave Jeju Island to seek UNHCR refugee status in Bangkok, Thailand. However, one family of 4 remained in Jeju as the PRC consulate refused to issue a passport to their newborn baby, claiming their asylum application was illegal. And later on, they were able to get to Thailand and reunited with other church members. So most of the group submitted their refugee application to the UNHCR Bangkok office on September 5th. And now the Thai government has refused to renew their tourist visas for the church members, which began to expire on October 5th. According to the travel agent, who helped their visa extension process, the Chinese embassy in Bangkok demanded the Thai government to send each passport of those Mayflower Church to be examined inside the Chinese embassy. So both human rights groups and the US embassy officials view this as transnational repression by China. I echo Commissioner and Congressman Frank Wolf's sentiment. And so the danger of them being forced repatriation is very real. Actually, just before this hearing started, I just learned and verified a Chinese family from China, a mother and father with 2 children, 8 years old and 10 years old. After they were just being arrested by the Thai authorities, and after the travel to Thailand. All of the 4 family members have a visa issued by the U.S. On their way to come to the U.S. So these parents were both ended up now in the Thailand immigration prison. And the horrible thing is that both the 8 and 10-year-old children, they are being like confiscated by the Thailand government, sending to a Thailand government managed orphanages in Chiang Mai, Thailand. So they are in the transition to be sent to the Bangkok immigration prison as we are talking. So these 64 now asylum seekers with multiple births since they left China 3 years ago from the Mayflower Church, they are facing every day this danger for forceful repatriation back to China. And despite of the difficulty of the situation, there are a few recommendations. Here I want to recommend the USCIRF and for your commission, the commission, and for the U.S. government to counter the CCP's transnational repression and to protect those like the Mayflower Church. First, I think the U.S. should immediately consider the 60 credible asylum seekers and other, especially religious persecuted, for at least a priority 1 refugee resettlement for their status designation. And the US must intervene to ensure the safety of the group and offer asylum where the right of the religious freedom to be protected as appropriate during this time. And second, I recommend the creation of a joint database between the USCIRF and the CECC to better track cases of the CCP's transnational repression toward religious freedom and human rights expatriates and advocates. We have Chinese churches in Los Angeles. I mean, we're coerced to sing the Chinese national anthem, raising flags on the Chinese National Day in the US soil in Los Angeles. And FBI has set up a task force on transnational repression. So I think this both the USCIRF and the CECC can work together to make sure we receive these accurate cases and help verify them by working with other NGOs. Finally, China has harassed technology to control the voices of dissidents and persecution survivors, even when they are seemingly safe outside of China. We must also ensure their safety. The harassment and the intimidation by the long arms of the CCP, especially in some Arab countries, Gulf Coast countries, who are setting black jails, intercepting those who are fleeing from East Turkestan, from Tibet, and put them in black jails. We documented at least with witnesses in Dubai, UAE. So I think with multilateral approach, I will urge the USCIRF and working with the administration to help stop this trend. Thank you.
Pastor Fu, thank you so much for your testimony. Now we'd like to go to our final witness, Zach Smith. Mr. Smith, if you could begin your testimony.
Thank you so much. Let's be blunt. China is an international bad actor. The list of its human rights abuses, as we've heard today, particularly its suppression of religious minorities, is long and growing longer. It's undisputed that China has sought to influence US policy not only at the federal level, but at the state and local levels in the United States too. In fact, a recent Heritage Foundation report makes clear that China's attempts to influence state and local governments have been ongoing for decades and are widespread. Never before in our nation's history has a foreign adversary had such deep inroads into US state and local politics. The range and persistence of China's operations far surpass those of any previous geopolitical rivals. So what can be done about these lobbying efforts? Can Congress prohibit lobbying by the CCP or those working on its behalf? And if so, what are the limitations that Congress would face? The answer to these questions is yes, but it can become tricky fast. So that's why it's important to understand the current statutory framework in surrounding registration of foreign agents and lobbying disclosure, as well as some of the relevant constitutional concerns that will likely arise if Congress legislates in this area. Congress first implemented our current disclosure-based system in the 1930s when faced with the crisis of an ascendant Nazi Germany and its dangerous ideology. In 1938, Congress passed and President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Since that time, FARA, as this act is commonly known, has undergone 3 major amendments, with the last one occurring in 1995. Today, there is bipartisan consensus that FARA is not working as well as it should. Uncertainty and concerns about selective and potentially partisan enforcement abound. There can be uncertainty around who qualifies as a foreign principal under the statute, who qualifies as a foreign agent, and whether any registration exemptions apply to those who would otherwise qualify and have to register. These uncertainties undermine FARA's disclosure-based goals. Another relevant statute is the Lobbying Disclosure Act. Congress passed this law in 1995, which requires certain individuals to disclose their lobbying activities. Unlike FARA, which the Justice Department administers, the clerks of the House and the Senate administer the LDA. When Congress passed the LDA, it also passed key amendments to FARA, making clear that certain individuals did not have to register under FARA, but had to register, if at all, under the less onerous and less stigmatizing LDA. This has widely been called the Lobbying Disclosure Act loophole. As a result of this loophole, those who lobby on behalf of foreign companies or foreign individuals, but not directly on behalf of foreign governments or foreign political parties, must register under the LDA, but not FARA. The Supreme Court has twice upheld FARA over constitutional challenges, but the relevant constitutional question is slightly different if Congress considers going beyond requiring identification and disclosure by agents of foreign governments and seeks to regulate or limit those agents' activities. Congress can constitutionally take these actions because foreign nations and foreign political parties are not in the same legal position as US citizens when it comes to their rights to influence governments within the United States. In fact, Congress has already exercised that power in an important respect. Foreign citizens and foreign governments are banned from contributing to the political campaigns of those running for federal, state, or local office. All of this is to say there's no constitutional prohibition against banning lobbying by foreign governments or even foreign nationals. Even US citizens can be prohibited from lobbying on behalf of a foreign government. Certain restrictions on lobbying by American citizens on behalf of American citizens are already codified and enforced. If some restrictions on that type of lobbying are permissible, then restrictions or even prohibition of lobbying on behalf of foreign governments is also permissible, especially because lobbying on behalf of a foreign government is materially different from lobbying on behalf of an American citizen. The former poses risks to the nation's security that are not present when someone lobbies on behalf of a state, a municipality, or even a private business. Now, some might argue that such a prohibition would violate the First Amendment. If they argue that, they would be wrong. To be sure, citizens, unlike foreign governments or officials, have a First Amendment right to petition the government for redress of grievances. And they can do this no matter the grievance and no matter who benefits from the government's ultimate action. This type of petitioning is fine and encouraged so long as that American citizen is not legally acting on behalf of a foreign government as a lobbyist. Congress can prohibit this latter action. The Constitution does not stand in the way, and there is a good case to be made that it should take this step. Such a step likely will not and cannot solve every avenue that foreign governments may use in their attempts to influence our governmental actors here in the United States, but it's a concrete first step that deserves further debate and discussion. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now we will move to our questioning part of the question and answers part of the hearing. If I could begin by asking a question to all of you, actually two-part question. One, if you could help to explain, will help us to better understand the Chinese authorities, the CCP's view with respect to religion in particular. Because to me, in the United States, especially even in the policy circle, people don't really appreciate the hostility, the CCP's hostility to religion in particular. The Chinese, as you know, have elevated religion or integrated any type of religious practices to national security, which has not been the case in the United States and other Western liberal democracies. To me, this is something very important, need to be addressed. And then on the technology question, I invite you, all of you, to comment. How do we stop the U.S. government, United States, American tech firms continue to make all of us complicit through sharing technology and also through investment that specifically the Chinese tech firms that have been facilitating, intensifying the persecution of ethno-religious groups in China?
Maybe I can start since I was the first speaker.
Yes, please.
I think on the first question, the key is control. The Chinese government can't stand anybody who has independent ideas, because religion, you know, if you're a real believer, you believe in God, your first allegiance is to God, is to the Dalai Lama or any other deity. And the Chinese government just can't stand that. So if you have independent thoughts, if you have independent thinking, if you don't want it to be controlled by the government, it just cannot tolerate that. I think that's the key to understand, you know, what the Chinese government want to do with religion. You know, that's why, you know, it's not that the Chinese government is only harsh on religious believers. It's harsh on dissidents, even you're atheist. If you don't believe in the Communist Party, if you want to have your independent thoughts, it's intolerable. On the second question, how to deal with the tech companies. You know, I would say something about U.S. tech companies. You know, the white paper protests, you know, Commissioner Cooper and others mentioned. Really, you know, right now I'm looking at who has been detained and disappeared because they went out to protest. And a lot of people who told me, you know, I went there, I thought nobody knew, but then the next day the police came to me and questioned me. And I would say, you know, Apple, this gigantic US company, has become an integral part of the Chinese government censorship and the surveillance apparatus. You know, over the years, Apple has censored so many apps the Chinese government doesn't like, VPNs, you know, the New York Times, and other, you know, religious apps, even the, you know, the Quran and the Bible apps that were popular. And Apple also has, you know, set a data center in China that are co-owned by the Chinese government. So it's very easy for the Chinese government to have access to the data of Apple users in China. So, I mean, these are just two examples. Over the years, Apple just made so many compromises in China. So it became part of the, you know, the surveillance and censorship apparatus the Chinese government has been, you know, imposing on its people. That's why, you know, it's so risky for the Chinese people to go out and protest, to practice their religious freedom. And, you know, what can we do about this company? It's a US company. You know, we at Human Rights Watch, we have written letters to Apple, have written emails, at least tell us what's your communication with the government, with the Chinese government, what kind of demand the Chinese government has made to you. But, there was no real, answer from Apple. Apple has been telling us, decline to comment. We cannot say anything publicly. Things like that. I mean, this is something the US government can do, make public, be transparent about what's going on, and, compel Apple to do human rights due diligence. Like what have you, Apple has been telling the public, we have done, audit in terms of our supply chain, the Foxconn company, Foxconn, which is a major supply of manufacturer of Apple products. So at least this is something that we can agree on, tell us what's going on. And the US government has the power to force Apple to tell us what's going on.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else wanted to comment?
Yeah, I
May I
can
just add?
Oh, sorry. Go on.
Sorry. Just a quick one. First, on religion, I think the Chinese government understands the power of religion. But now they want to use that power to help the Communist Party rather than believers. So that's the underlying part. Secondly, on technological firm, I think the USCIRF can work with Congress to see that US corporations who work on technological matters with China really understand the issues. Congress has brought Yahoo, Google to task in the past, and you can continue to do that by shining a light on their behavior and getting them to understand why this is imperative that their attitude needs to change. Thank you.
Pastor Fu?
Yes, for the first question, I think the Chinese Communist Party has never changed this original concept, understanding of religion as the opium of the people. So basically, they took over the years. The only difference is between the Cultural Revolution time of 10 years that they declared basically all religion are illegal. So basically, even sending their government-sanctioned church or other clergymen into re-education. Versus after that, to allow some existence is whether this opium can be utilized, can be useful for their ideological control, as Yatu just mentioned, and also for the so-called national security. So we have to all understand, I mean, the Communist Party treats religion as a national security issue. I can give you a reference. If you're interested, back to, I think it's 2001, I co-published with the UCLA 2 volumes on religious freedom, national security in China by basically translating and combining of volumes of multiple Communist Party issued secret and some top secret documents regarding their treatment of religion, Falun Gong, religious freedom. So to them, it's a national security issue. They actually treat a cross on the church of the rooftop of the church as a national security threat. So that's, I think, unfortunately, we're not being understood by the broad, the free world. To answer your second question is, I think, really, to address the Western technology, tech company as accomplices, we just really first step just to enforce what the law. Number one is, the religious freedom is in the Article 18 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the several UN mandate, norms, and wish for Apple to remove the app of the Bible, Quran, and religious materials from the Chinese Apple store. Basically, that is a violation of the international law by basically denying the access to the fundamental literature of the religious believers. And of course, many religious believers were sent to the concentration camp, re-education through labor camp. I mean, many Western companies are complicit in still ordering products like the Wisconsin, Milwaukee tools. I mean, they are found basically in the Sichuan prison in Hunan, are still manufacturing millions of gloves by the political prisoners. We know. I mean, like Chong Yuan, like the Taiwanese prisoner, Mr. Lee. So we should, I mean, there is US law, as Louisa mentioned, to forbid this. So we need to have Congress and administration to compel those complicit companies to point it out, to really even prosecute. So I'm not a lawyer, but I'm sure, you know, when you are in violation of the law, this should be held accountable.
Thank you. Like, I'm now like to give an opportunity to commissioners to ask questions. I'd like to begin with Vice Chair Cooper.
Thank you, Chair Turkel. It's incredibly powerful testimony from your witnesses. And actually, what I really just want to do is to echo discussions that we've had internally. But I think that the situation, human rights and the religious destruction of religious freedoms in China, in a very tough year for human rights and religious freedom all over the globe, China stands alone in a completely different category. And I think, you know, perhaps we can ask Senator Rubio and others if we can obtain additional subvention to put some additional expertise and staff on this issue, so that first, we become better conversant, and secondly, that we're able to serve as a more effective platform to sound the alarm. Also, in just a general comment, because of my age, having grown up in primarily in a previous century, but I think it also emphasizes the tremendous need and potential clout, especially of USCIRF, to remind Americans that we need to act on these core issues in a bipartisan way in order to break through to people who have levers of power on the one hand, and also to reach out to the TikTok generations, some of whom have difficulty even identifying where Asia is, let alone a particular city with 20 million people in China. We have a profound educational arc that I would just say, based on the previous century, when we all worked together on human rights issues, that arc can be shortened by consistently putting a human face on the suffering and on the issues. When you do that, you're able to bring it down and essentially challenge each and every one of us that's holding our iPhone or whatever the technology may be, to say, hey, wait a second, at what cost? You know, making these choices for us as consumers into informed moral choices. We're very far off from that. It's not the unique or lone responsibility of USCIRF, but I think we can and should try to be cast a more powerful light on these issues, but without diminishing our monitoring and speaking out on 26 other disaster areas on the globe. But clearly, China demands an elevated focus and attention from all Americans, but including our commission.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Commissioner Davey.
Thank you, Commissioner Turkel. Much appreciated, Mr. Chair. So just a quick comment and then a question. And my question is primarily for Mr. Shering. So I, maybe to the chagrin of all of you on this Zoom, about 10 years ago, went to China as a tourist and experienced firsthand the full, experienced firsthand the breadth and the reach of the Chinese government's ability to use technology to interfere not only with the lives of its citizens, but with the people visiting there. And the situation presented itself most starkly when we went up to Tibet. And there were two self-immolations of Tibetan monks while we were there. We were watching CNN in a hotel, and the TV went off. Our phones stopped working. And for 18 hours, we were completely cut off from the outside world. No communication at all, no ability to communicate with anyone until the government decided that we could. So I want to appreciate, I want to, in my limited way, appreciate from a personal experience, the depth and the reach, and that was 10 years ago. So I know, and from what we hear, that reach and influence has only grown exponentially. I also just want to say it was brave of a number of Tibetan monks there to pull us aside and to encourage us not to believe what we saw, that we were seeing show Buddhism, as they called it, and really encouraged us to bring that message back to the US and even as tourists. So, but my question is, I have two, one related to this and then one related to lobbying. So the one related to Tibet has to do with what are the ways the agents of the Chinese government target, intimidate, or mistreat Tibetans living abroad? And which countries are Tibetan Buddhists particularly vulnerable to such harassment and intimidation? And in what ways are emerging technologies playing a role in this repression of Tibetans living abroad? And then finally, what should we do? What should USCIRF do, or what should be done to protect vulnerable Tibetans living abroad? And then just a question about lobbying, maybe for Mr. Smith. As USCIRF, we can't, our mandate is not domestic, it is international. But I do think that some effort should be made to get, if not current legislators, at least legislators, Congress people, et cetera, maybe those who are running for office and those who are running for re-election, to take some kind of pledge against engaging in lobbying for repressive regimes around the world. That's something maybe the Heritage Foundation can do that USCIRF cannot. So thank you, and I'd be interested in your responses to any of that. Thanks so much.
Chairman Turkle, if I may respond to the Commissioner. Yeah.
Yes,
On the
please.
issue of harassment of Tibetans abroad, our co-panelists will know that the Chinese Communist Party has a specific, harmlessly named department called the United Front, which has agents in almost all of the Chinese embassies abroad. And their main task is to create divisiveness in the communities with which the Chinese government is working. For example, in our case, with the Tibetan communities, there's always some United Front agent, either directly or indirectly involved in Tibetan affairs. We have seen in New York, for example, a police officer of NYPD who was seen to have been in collusion with the United Front. Similarly, the Chinese authorities use the leverage of visas for Tibetan Americans to visit their families or relatives as a way to make them toe the official line. Because when even though Tibetan Americans have the same passport as a non-Tibetan American, when they go to the Chinese consulate, there is immediately racial profiling, and Tibetan Americans are sent through the United Front process, which doesn't actually have to doesn't have any responsibility for visas. So that's how they control Tibetan. They've also used Tibetan lamas with whom they sort of create some sort of groups that are aimed at criticizing the Dalai Lama and the mainstream Tibetan community abroad to create divisiveness within the community. So these are some of the things that the Chinese authorities do. And USCIRF can sort of highlight the role of the United Front, including in, for example, the United Front has Tibetan speaking people in some of the embassies. It still has one in the consulate in New York. And so these people should be targeted, spotlighted, and their sort of behavior should be monitored. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Curry.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, I think
sorry.
Commissioner Davey had a brief question about the lobbying piece. I was just going to quickly respond to, if that's okay. And I appreciate the question, Commissioner Davey. I absolutely think an educational campaign for candidates and government officials is needed for the influence that China and other repressive regimes have on trying to influence our government. Where China is unique in some ways is the level of influence and the pervasive actions they've taken to lobby, not only at the federal level through various entities and companies, but also at the state and local levels as well. And so you're seeing a really pervasive effort by the Chinese government to push their ideas and ideologies at all levels of government. And one of the other areas I think that we've also seen this in is the Chinese government has been very effective in getting American companies to lobby on their behalf. We saw this with companies like Nike, Apple, Coca-Cola, and others that came out opposing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Now, I don't think you could necessarily ban American companies from lobbying, for their own views, but it's certainly very problematic. And these companies that take these positions certainly do, in my view, deserve to be named and shamed for taking many of these positions.
Thank you. Mr. Wolf and Mr. Curry.
Let Mr. Curry go first.
Thank you very much to the chair. Thank you, Commissioner Wolf. Any one of these issues would be horrifying. Put together, it's truly stunning to see forced labor, the issues, forced marriage, and on and on and on. So it's hard to know where to dive in with limited time. But perhaps I could ask Louisa Greevy, forgive me if I mispronounced that, about the issue of China harassing Uyghurs here in the United States and abroad. What recommendations do you have to the U.S. government or to us as regards to this kind of harassment? Because I've heard many personal stories on this, and it's greatly concerning that they're reaching citizens in this country and harassing them for their religious faith and ethnicity. So perhaps you could comment on that.
Thank you so much for this question. We have seen definitely national law enforcement efforts to track and prosecute, right? Which there might have been a hesitation in the past, but these have now happened. The New York City police officer, 2 big cases in New York, in fact, have been announced publicly, and we would urge more of that. But of course, it's also a deterrence issue. Law enforcement can only reach perpetrators on US soil. You can indict someone in another country, as for example, the US has done on some hackers, some PLA hackers and some Russian hackers, but they're not going to come to trial. So the deterrent effect is, all right, they can't come to the US because they'll be arrested. They weren't going to come anyway. So what we need is actually a national policy of deterrence. We need a more serious effort at the level of our foreign policy, our White House and our State Department to send a clear message, have a policy conditionality that as long as our own constitutional rights of our own fellow citizens, visitors, and residents are being routinely violated, they're not going. There's certain goodies that the Chinese government would want should absolutely be denied. So this has to be really at the level of deterrence and at the policy level, I'm sorry to say.
Thank you, Louisa. Mr. Wolf?
Well, thank you, Chair. I want to thank the USCIRF and the Commission for having this hearing. This is one of the better hearings I've ever attended. And I want to thank all of the witnesses. They really did an outstanding. I wish every member of Congress, House and Senate, could have really heard what was on today. I have so many questions. I'm not going to get into it, but I mean, is it accurate to say that Hikvision cameras are in the camps that are persecuting Uyghurs? Is that accurate? Just yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Secondly, do we agree that there is genocide against the Uyghurs?
Yes.
But I mean, and I also believe there's cultural genocide against the Tibetans. So I think all of the groups, all of you have to come to work together. And I'm really sort of disappointed in the church in the West not speaking out. I mean, during what took place in Nazi Germany, when the church was very, very reluctant. I've always admired Dietrich Bonhoeffer being willing to speak out. We need Bonhoeffers in the church here in the United States and in the West to speak out. The fact that is it accurate? Whoever can say yes or no that Hikvision has former members of Congress lobbying for them? Yes or no?
Yes, that's accurate.
Yes.
But how can you be a congressman who've come to town to do well and do good and to be doing that, to lobby for anyone who's been connected to genocide is I think, and Zach, I saw your comment. Man, you just encouraged me. I have great respect for the Heritage Foundation. I always care deeply what they said. You guys can really make a difference. I think there should be a bill passed in Congress, and I agree with what Commissioner Cooper said. This has to be bipartisan. This is not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. This has to be bipartisan, but we should prohibit any former member of Congress or former high-level official to then go out after they leave Congress to go and work. Now, does the Chinese embassy, I heard, does the Chinese embassy actually have a lobby firm here in town that represents them?
They have a variety of entities.
Well, here we have, they're persecuting Catholics. Colonel Zen, God bless him, 90 years old. Bob, how many Protestant pastors are in jail today?
Oh, there should be hundreds of,
Hundreds.
perhaps thousands. Yeah.
Do you agree that there's cultural genocide taking place in Tibet?
Yeah.
Yes. Do we agree that there's actual genocide against the Uyghur Muslims?
Absolutely.
Do we know there's organ harvesting where they're taking people's organs out? I saw Chairman Turkle did an event at Hudson a couple of months ago. There's 60,000. Do we agree that organ harvesting is taking place?
Yes.
Well, then the Congress has to deal with this. The administration has to deal with it. And if you may have seen, Director Wray of the FBI said they are a direct national security threat to our country. We know they have Confucius Institutes on college campuses. We know that Xi has gone and met with the Iranians. Does Xi support the Russians against what they're doing against the Ukrainian people? Yes, they do. And so this is, I tell you, if you had a roll call vote in Congress and the person got up and said, we want to stop the genocide taking place against the Uyghur Muslims, and therefore we want to stop what's taking place against the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. We want to stop what's taking place against the Tibetans, where there is cultural genocide in Tibet. We want to stop the organ harvesting. So therefore, the vote today will be no American company should lobby for, and also certainly no former member of the House or the Senate or no one who's ever had a high-ranking position in the government, positively banned. So I hope all the churches speak out after hearing what you said. Zach, I hope Heritage will move on this. Anything that I could do to help you, I'd be glad to come downtown and sit with you sometime. Listen, a lot of these people that are representing them are good people. I mean, I think they kind of joined the representation world with the idea that maybe China will change. We can change China. I know that was the whole debate during the MFN. Well, we give them MFN, they'll change. China hasn't changed. China hasn't changed at all. So I think you got to deal with this issue. And I think those of us who are still around at this time need to speak out, because we cannot let this thing go on. We need a law that bans it. I urge all of you on this panel to come together, to get together, and all the groups. I know you have your individual ones, but come to work on something like this and work with Zach. And lastly, Bob, do you know, with regard to Mayflower Church, do you know, are there not cases I have read where the Chinese government, CCP police have come in and taken people from different countries and taken them back?
Oh, absolutely. There's documented case from even Pattaya, the Swedish citizen, the bookstore Gui Minghai was kidnapped from Pattaya, from Thailand, back to China, and went for trial, and he's still not released back to Sweden. And we have State Department officials working with me, even within a day, we have seen a Kazakh dissident who has evidence of organ harvesting escaped to the Bangkok International Airport, and became vanished in the airport, kidnapped back to China. We have never heard, perhaps he is already being killed. So, I mean, this is very well documented.
Well, I was at one place where they said this one person was arrested and he's never been seen again. And so I hope the State Department is watching this, that they allow the Mayflower people to come in quickly, because it will be a frightening event if we hear next week, tomorrow, later, that someone has been kidnapped and taken back. And I also hope that the American Embassy in Thailand visits the Mayflower people to sort of let them know we do care about these people, and they're willing to come in. And I know there's a group down in Texas that are paying for all these things. Is it not true that there's a group waiting to take them, to help them in Tyler, Texas?
Yeah, I mean, we have a group of churches in Tyler. They are already well prepared and pledged to support for their full year of all the living expenses. And the fact that, they can afford just to fly to Mexico and just to follow the crowd and use the legal way to come, but they with the full integrity, they want to do things legally. So that's, with the asylum process, with the humanitarian parole or whatever the mechanism. So that's something I think is unfortunate. I think we should really encourage them through the legal process.
I appreciate that they've been willing, and they're doing it the right way legally. They're not flying to Mexico and paying a bandito to take them across the border. I'm grateful that they're doing that, and so I think it's important that they be able to come to the United States. In closing, I want to thank the commissioners, and I want to thank the USCIRF staff. Again, this is one of the best hearings I've ever had and heard. I would hope all the members of Congress could see something like this. I hope the church speaks out on some of these issues. I hope all of you will kind of work together. And Zach, I hope Heritage, with the great credibility and reputation you all have, will take this issue on, because the thought of someone representing a company that's involved with genocide against the Uyghurs in these detention camps, it officially makes me sick. And I think this cannot be permitted to continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are reaching to the end of our hearing, but before we close, I would like to give an opportunity to each witnesses to share some final thoughts. But if I could use my seat as a chair, I cannot miss this opportunity to ask Louisa before I pass the floor over to the commissioners. If you could shed some light on something very important to me personally, and also you heard Mr. Wolf speaking his frustration about the so many wrong things happening in our country, in our attitude, our responses to the atrocity committed against people in China. Can you tell us what is working, what is not working, and what should we be doing to stop this genocide that it is in its 6th year? And also on something very important, Forced Labor Prevention Act. Is it being effectively, fully enforced? If not, what can we do to push that to be fully enforced?
Thank you so much, Nuri. In fact, my answer to your first question was going to be the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. You know, the way it ultimately passed included a lot of procedural points, which some advocates were concerned that this was really a matter of slowing things down with the public hearing, with public comment submissions, with publication of a strategy, and then requirement for consultation. And was this going to be an opportunity for the lobbyists, for the companies, the importers that do not want to be bothered with more restrictions on their supply chains? In fact, in our experience, it's been just the opposite. UHRP works and Human Rights Watch in this group are both members of a very broad coalition, the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region, which is meeting very intensely. I personally am in 2 or 3 meetings every single week, monitoring the implementation and certainly monitoring the effect globally. I will say that this kind of narrowly focused economic leverage dealing with imports from the Uyghur region, which is rich in minerals, in automotives, in cotton, in critical parts of supply chains that reach really all over the globe. This is a way to avoid the question of, am I outraged? Have they heard from Mr. Wolf or any of you who's so impassioned? And rather looking at the technicalities of the law, and that puts the machinery of our government in motion. The EU needs to do the same. Australia and UK needs to do the same. This is the way to create the leverage required to first remove complicity, but of course that's not enough. We want to remove the enablers, and we want to impact the impact on what the Chinese government cares about.
Thank you. If I could go around to ask each of you to share some final thoughts. If I could begin with Wang Yaqiu, and then I will move to our commissioners.
Thank you. I just wanted to leave a hopeful note because, the white paper protest happened. I didn't expect that to happen. I cried when I see people say Xi Jinping stepped down, the CCP stepped down. This was extraordinary, those young people. We all thought young people were pretty brainwashed. They only care about their, social media stuff. But, people want their rights. And, being in the United States, I saw Chinese people who went to protests and they were saying, end the Uyghur camps. You saw the Han people didn't care. They cared. They are awakening to the sufferings happened to the Uyghurs and Tibetans, right? So, those I didn't expect it. And I do think there's a widening awakening happening very much because of the COVID situation, because Xi Jinping assumed the 3rd term. So, fundamental changes to China will come from Chinese people. And I are saying change, the change of heart among the Chinese people.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Puchun?
Thank you. I want to emphasize the fact that whether it's the United States government or American corporations, they need to adopt a principled stand in their relationship with China. We are not against China as a nation. We are not against the Chinese as a people. What we are against is the Chinese Communist Party's brutal policy of suppression that the corporations and government particularly should uphold the fundamental American values of liberty, democracy, equality in their dealings with China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Louisa?
Thank you. I would like to echo what Zach Smith said about the outdated nature of our lobbying disclosure laws. I think even the USCIRF mandate may be a little bit outdated because you're mandated to report on and make recommendations, which was groundbreaking at the time, the Frank Wolf religious freedom law, to actually pay attention country by country, look deeply in and document. Now we need to say who is looking at the international suppression and who are the perpetrators of that affecting countries that might not be on a CPC list. They may not be subject to sanctions, but there ought to be policy responses both in the US and hopefully setting an example for other countries. So looking at the issue of transnational repression of religious rights should be in the USCIRF mandated if it isn't already.
Thank you. Great points. Bob?
Yeah, I would like to see some specific congressional hearings to summon those the head of those Western companies like Apple, like the Milwaukee Tools. I remembered when Congressman Smith and Congressman Wolf basically subpoenaed or summoned the Yahoo CEO to the committee, basically facing the victims of those writers who were imprisoned 8 years, 10 years as a result of Yahoo's retrieval of their passwords. And that really changed the dynamic. I mean, we working with the AOC and VOC and other organizations, we rescued a few, families, survivors of the concentration camp, Kazakh, we have Gwazira, we have Kyrgyz, the ethnic Kyrgyz Joseph, who survived in the concentration camp and saw, the Hikvision cameras all over in the concentration camp, the cells. I think we need to have those petitioner, have those lobbyists also there to face the victims of the genocide and so to let them answer from their conscience. I think it's not only just a moral, I think there is a legal aspect too. So that's what I want to see. We'd be glad to support that effort.
Thank you very much. Zach?
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about this issue today. I agree with Commissioner Wolf. This is very important and will continue to be important because the Chinese Communist Party is going to continue its efforts to influence governmental action at both the federal and state levels. And so I think it's imperative that Congress and state legislators begin thinking about these issues and what appropriate actions they can take as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. If I could go to the commissioners, starting with Vice Chair Cooper.
Thank you. First of all, it's been an extremely humbling time personally for me to try to absorb everything that's coming in the scope of what we're looking at. I would just make two general comments. Number one, to the extent that USCIRF can, we should try to encourage bipartisan hearings in both the U.S. Senate and the House. There's plenty of blame to look backwards, but looking forward with all of the issues that were raised today, including our specific and narrow focus of quote unquote religious freedom, there's plenty there to make sure that the voices and those voices like we heard today will be heard directly on Capitol Hill. To the extent that we can influence that process, we should. And secondly, because we all know that there are all kinds of people listening to this webinar, I think that USCIRF in a more closed session should consider approaching the Chinese government to ask for a visit to China, but include in our requests specific names, starting with the Cardinal and others, specific names, locations, and issues that we want to see addressed. I think getting a yes will be a challenge. Getting a no will be useful for further exposing the Chinese Communist Party, and getting no answer is also a response. So this is something that shouldn't be decided on a webinar, but I'm saying it publicly for a reason. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wolf?
I want to thank the witnesses. They really all did a great job. And I want to thank the commissioners too for their interest and their commitment. And I agree with Commissioner Cooper that this needs to be bipartisan. And lastly, I want to thank the staff of USCIRF for really putting on a great hearing. I hope this is distributed and people all over the United States can watch it. But thank you, everybody. I'm grateful.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Davey?
Thank you, Chair. Much appreciated. Again, thanks to the witnesses. Let me just say, as a Presbyterian clergyman and a African-American here in the United States, often when I go abroad, I hear, don't you have enough issues to deal with of your own, such that you don't have time to be addressing other people's issues? Two clergymen's voices ring in my ears when I hear that. One is Pastor Niemöller, when he said, I didn't speak up, and when they came for me, there was no one to speak for me. And the other, of course, is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. It's in that spirit that I do the work that I do with my colleagues at USCIRF. I want to thank you, thank the staff, thank my colleagues. And we've got a lot of work to do. You help to make it not be so overwhelming. And I appreciate what you do every day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Curry?
I just want to pass on my thanks to everybody who testified. Incredibly important issue. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I wanted to thank our professional staff team for us commissioners to suggest hearing. We're asked to organize hearing it relatively easy. The actual heavy lifting, the actual work lies with the staff team, contacting potential witnesses, working on logistics, and doing background research. It requires a lot of time and effort. I wanted to thank our executive director and research team and our comms team, specifically Veronica and Danielle, and our policy expert Mingzhi for help us to organize this hearing. I'd like to conclude by reminding that we are seeing IBM 2.0 when it comes to business complicity in atrocity crimes. Those of us who are a student of history remember the business complicity in the Holocaust. That includes some of the companies implicated in today's slave labor practices in China, namely Volkswagen, Hugo Boss. I mentioned IBM because years ago, roughly about 20 years ago, when the Chinese were developing technology to surveil its own population, Western businesses, including some businesses in Silicon Valley that have been also in today's part of today's discussion, have been supporting very subtly the Chinese tech firms. The surveillance techniques initially shared by Western firms that includes German Siemens, Sun Microsystem, and IBM, Intel. These are the companies are still not getting the message. Whatever these companies and others being mentioned lobbying against the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in contradiction to American values and in opposition to the value of humanity through their economic ties with the Uyghur region-based entities. Religious freedom is the first human rights for American people. We will continue to speak out, we'll continue to call them out. We will continue to research and document wherever religious persecution occurs, because this is the best way, this is one of the most effective ways to prevent religious persecution or any type of atrocities turning into full swing genocide. war, as we've seen in Ukraine. We have to be bold. We have to be clear in our approach when we're speaking out against religious persecution. I wanted to also mention that the Uyghur people very grateful for the United States government and 9 other governments and parliaments entities have given a proper name to the atrocities being committed against Uyghurs and others in China. But not only genocide should never happen, but it should not take 6 years for governments to respond. There are more than 150 state parties to the Genocide Convention. Only 9 of them, plus European Union, have done their dues. But the rest of them are still not being able to even give a crime's proper name, which is very distressful. So the Uyghur people have paid ultimate price to wake up the world to this brutal regime and its capabilities. We've seen it, what they can be able to do in Tibet for years. And we have seen it in Hong Kong. We have seen it in the Uyghur homeland, East Turkestan, and they're posing daily threat against our democratic ally, Taiwan. So it's on us. It's on us to wake up, and it's on us to be bold and strategic to stop this regime from continuing to do these kind of abuses in the homeland. Not only that, exporting the same techniques. With that, I wanted to thank you all, to our witnesses in particular, and also those of you who are tuning in and listening to this insightful, informative conversation. With that, the hearing is adjourned.